The day the council summoned him, the sky above the village hung low and gray, like it too had been forced into something it did not want. Ayan had always believed that a man's life should be his own, earned by sweat, defended by honor, and shaped by choice. But in their mountain village, tradition stood taller than any man, and the council's word carried more weight than the cliffs that guarded their valley. When the elder's messenger knocked at his wooden door, Ayan already knew what it meant. He had avoided the whispers for months, the knowing looks from the market vendors, the hushed conversations that died when he entered a room. He was 30, unwed, and stubbornly uninterested in the alliances the council tried to arrange. In their eyes, he was not just a man, he was a responsibility. The council chamber was carved from stone, cold and ancient. Oil lamps flickered against the walls, casting long shadows that made the elders look like towering judges of fate. Ayan stood before them, arms folded, jaw tight. Elder Karim spoke first, his voice slow and heavy. "You know why you are here." Ayan did not respond. He would not give them the satisfaction. The elder continued, explaining that the village needed unity, that old rivalries between families threatened to fracture what their ancestors had built. There was only one solution: Ayan would marry Alara, the daughter of the family they had feuded with for generations. The marriage would bind the families together, end the silent hostility, and restore balance. Ayan felt the words strike him like stones. He had seen Alara only a handful of times, always from a distance, her face partially hidden beneath a shawl, her expression unreadable. He knew nothing of her except that she belonged to the family he had been taught to distrust. His father had died carrying bitterness in his heart over that rivalry. How could he betray that memory? "I will not," Ayan said firmly, his voice echoing in the chamber. A murmur rippled among the elders. Refusal was not something they tolerated lightly. Elder Karim leaned forward. "This is not a request. The village comes before personal desire. If you refuse, your land will be reassigned, your name struck from the council's records. You will leave with nothing." The threat was clear. Everything Ayan had worked for, his home, his fields, the small herd he had raised from calves, would be taken. He thought of the soil under his fingernails, the sunrise over his crops, the life he had built with his own hands. Was his pride worth losing it all? That night, sleep would not come. Ayan sat outside his home, staring at the distant lights of Alara's family estate across the valley. Somewhere in that large house, she too must have heard the decree. Did she resent it as much as he did? Or was she obedient, ready to accept whatever fate was handed to her? He imagined a cold, sharp-tongued woman who would remind him daily that he had been forced into this union. The thought hardened his resolve, yet fear crept in. If he refused, he would become an outcast. If he agreed, he would live bound to a stranger. By dawn, exhaustion replaced anger. The council's messenger returned for his answer. Ayan did not look at him as he spoke. "Tell them I will do it." The words tasted like ash. As the messenger left, Ayan felt something inside him close, a door to the future he had imagined for himself. He told himself it was sacrifice for the greater good, that love was a luxury he had never needed. Marriage, he believed, was a contract. Nothing more. The wedding was arranged swiftly. The village square filled with people eager to witness the end of an era of hostility. Ayan stood beneath the ceremonial arch, dressed in traditional attire, his expression unreadable. When Alara approached, silence fell. She moved gracefully, her dark hair braided with silver threads, her eyes lowered. For the first time, Ayan truly looked at her. There was no arrogance, no defiance, only a quiet strength that unsettled him. When their hands were joined, her fingers trembled slightly. So she did not want this either. As vows were spoken and blessings given, Ayan felt the weight of every gaze upon them. The council smiled in satisfaction. The village celebrated. But beneath the music and laughter, two strangers stood side by side, bound by law, united by obligation. When the festivities ended and they returned to Ayan's home, now their home, the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Inside the small house, Alara removed her shawl and looked around quietly. "I will not be a burden," she said softly, breaking the silence. It was the first time he had heard her voice, clear, steady, unexpectedly warm. Ayan nodded stiffly. "We will keep to ourselves," he replied. "This marriage is for them, not for us." She met his eyes then, and for a fleeting moment, something passed between them, an understanding born not of affection, but of shared captivity. That night, they lay on opposite sides of the room, separated not by walls, but by pride and pain. Ayan stared at the ceiling, convincing himself that his heart would remain untouched. He had agreed to a marriage, not to love. He did not yet know that sometimes the strongest chains are the ones that quietly teach you how to be free. The first weeks of their marriage unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. polite, distant, restrained. Elara rose before dawn, tending to the hearth and preparing meals without complaint. Ion worked the fields longer than necessary, avoiding the unfamiliar presence waiting at home. They spoke only when needed, their words brief and measured. To the village, they appeared harmonious, a symbol of reconciliation. Inside their home, silence lingered like a third inhabitant. But silence has a way of revealing truths. Ion began to notice small things. Elara hummed softly while kneading dough, melodies he did not recognize but found himself listening for. She handled his tools with care when cleaning, never moving anything from its place. She mended his worn shirts without being asked, her stitches precise and patient. There was no resentment in her actions, only quiet diligence. One evening, a storm swept down from the mountains, fierce and sudden. Rain lashed against the roof, and thunder shook the walls. Ion rushed outside to secure the livestock, but the wind was stronger than he anticipated. A loose beam from the old shed collapsed, striking his shoulder and sending him to the ground. Pain shot through him, sharp and blinding. He struggled to stand, but the world tilted. Through the rain, he saw Elara running toward him, her dress soaked, hair coming undone. She knelt beside him without hesitation, her hands steady as she assessed his injury. "Lean on me," she said firmly. There was no fear in her voice, only resolve. Somehow she managed to help him back inside, cleaning the wound and binding his shoulder with practiced care. "You know how to do this?" he asked through clenched teeth. She nodded. "My mother was often ill. I learned." She did not elaborate, but her eyes darkened with memory. For the first time, Ion saw beyond the label of rival family. He saw a woman who had endured hardship quietly. Over the next days, as his shoulder healed, their dynamic shifted. Unable to work fully, Ion remained home, forced into proximity. They shared meals at the same table. Conversation, hesitant at first, began to flow in small streams. He learned that Elara loved to read, that she dreamed once of traveling beyond the valley. She learned that he had wanted to expand his farm, to cultivate new crops his father had only spoken of. One afternoon, she surprised him by suggesting a new irrigation method she had read about in an old book. Skeptical but curious, Ion listened. Together, they adjusted the water channels in his fields. Weeks later, the crops stood taller and greener than ever before. Pride flickered in his chest, not just in the harvest, but in the partnership forming between them. The village noticed the change too. Where once they walked apart, now they moved in quiet coordination. At the market, Elara spoke confidently beside him, her insights sharp and respected. Ion found himself defending her when an old acquaintance muttered about her family's past. "She is my wife," he said simply, the words carrying unexpected weight. Yet, despite the growing respect and companionship, Ion resisted the deeper emotion stirring within him. Love was dangerous. Love meant vulnerability, surrender. He reminded himself of how this began. Forced, unwanted. Could something imposed truly become genuine? The answer began revealing itself in the smallest moments. The way her laughter lingered in his thoughts long after it faded. The warmth he felt when her hand brushed his accidentally. The quiet comfort of her presence beside him at dusk as they watched the sun sink behind the mountains. One night, as they sat outside beneath a canopy of stars, Elara spoke softly. "Do you still resent me?" The question hung fragile in the air. Ion hesitated, searching for honesty. "I resented the choice," he admitted. "Not you." She nodded, eyes glistening in the moonlight. "I resented it too." In that shared confession, a barrier dissolved. They had both been victims of circumstance, both carrying burdens not of their making. Ion realized then that somewhere between obligation and understanding, something extraordinary had taken root. Winter arrived early that year, harsh and unrelenting. Snow blanketed the valley, isolating the village. Supplies ran low, and tensions rose as families struggled. The old rivalry threatened to resurface when a dispute broke out over shared grain stores. Voices were raised, accusations thrown. The council called an emergency gathering. To Ion's surprise, it was Elara who stepped forward in the crowded hall. Calm but firm, she proposed a fair distribution plan, one that required sacrifice from both sides. Her logic was clear, her compassion evident. Slowly, resistance softened. Even the most stubborn elders listened. Ion watched her with a swelling heart. This was no reluctant bride. This was a leader, a partner, a woman of strength and grace. When the meeting ended with agreement instead of division, Elder Karim approached them. "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully, "we chose wisely." Later that night, back home, Ion stood by the fire, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. Elara joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The flickering flames cast golden light across her face. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. She looked up, surprised but not withdrawing. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I thought this marriage would be a cage." but you have made it a home." Emotion shimmered in her eyes. "Love cannot be forced," she replied gently. "But it can grow." And grow it had. Not from grand gestures or fiery passion, but from shared labor, mutual respect, and quiet understanding. From storms weathered together and dreams rebuilt side by side. Ayan realized that love born from choice was beautiful, but love born from adversity was unbreakable. He drew her closer, no longer out of duty but desire. In her embrace, he felt something he had never expected: to find gratitude for the very decree he once despised. The council had bound them together, but it was patience and compassion that wove their hearts into one. Years later, when children's laughter filled their home, and the valley thrived in unity, Ayan would often look at Alara with silent wonder. The woman he had not wanted had become the love he could not imagine living without. And in the quiet moments before sleep, when the world was still and the past felt distant, he would whisper a truth he once thought impossible: sometimes fate knows the heart better than the heart knows itself.